Here we're going to talk about another strategy commonly used in research, surveys. You have all probably taken a survey before, whether you participated in research, took one in a class, or probably even on the internet somewhere. Surveys can be measured both quantitatively and qualitatively, but they have two critical characteristics. The first one is that they're measured using self-report type questions. Here, you ask participants to tell you about their thoughts, their feelings, or behaviors. The second characteristic is that you have to pay special attention to how you sample your participants. In a lot of survey research, you lean towards collecting large samples of participants. By having larger samples of people take your survey, this can be a more accurate estimation of the population. Just to make sure you understand the difference between samples and populations, a population is the entire group of people in a given area or domain. When you run studies, you sample people from within that population. So every experiment contains a sample or subset of people from a population. The contents of surveys can vary quite a bit. You can have an extremely long survey, or you can have an extremely short survey with just 2 questions, or it can be somewhere in between. Surveys can be administered in multiple ways. You can have an in-person, face-to-face interview with somebody. You can type up your survey, print them out, and mail them out to a bunch of people to fill out and send back. You might even have a phone interview before, where a researcher would call and ask you questions over the phone. The most common format of surveys nowadays is over the internet. Online surveys are the most accessible format of surveys, and it's generally the easiest way for a researcher to quickly collect data on a large number of participants. Surveys can be really on any topic, whether it's about motivation and emotion, personality, politics, or some other form of behavior. The majority of surveys are constructed in a way that you can analyze them statistically. But there are qualitative questions that you can ask that wouldn't be analyzed using statistics. Also, the vast majority of survey research is non-experimental, where we describe a variable or assess the relationship between variables. However, you can actually run experiments with surveys where you manipulate a variable. You can randomly assign people to 2 groups. Maybe you want to study the effects of reading a positive or negative newspaper article on thoughts and feelings later on. So you could assign half to read the positive article and half to read the negative article. Then everyone would answer the same survey questions after that. In this way, you still have everyone take an online survey, but you can also now make inferential claims about the causality of your manipulation. Surveys actually have quite a rich history, and here's pretty much your 30-second tour of that. Starting back in the 20th century, governmental programs started documenting various things such as the extent of poverty in the nation. By the 30s, a whole fleet of surveys were being administered to begin to measure both social and economic conditions. They needed to understand patterns about an entire population, and this helped to spur a motion to find better ways to use sampling procedures. Apart from governmental operations, a lot of marketing companies and other industry researchers started studying things like consumer preferences using surveys, and it was also started to be heavily used in politics as well. Nowadays, surveys are important for company market research all the way to every single academic field. Surveys are really important for medical fields as well, helping to establish estimates of the prevalence of various mental disorders across the nation as well as within certain states. Making surveys is actually more difficult than what you would think. Pretty much everything can influence the way a person responds, whether it's from the order of the questions to what kind of response options you're using to what the context is for the participant. Well, in order to think about this, it's good to keep in mind the cognitive model in which participants understand and respond to questions. First, respondents must interpret the question. Second, they must retrieve relevant information from memory. They have to retrieve the info that will enable them to answer the question. Third, they have to form a tentative judgment. Fourth, they convert that tentative judgment into one of the pre-specified response options required. And 5, they edit the response as needed. The book gives a good example of how many alcoholic drinks do you consume in a typical day? And the options are a lot more than average, somewhat more than average, average, somewhat fewer than average, or a lot fewer than average. Okay, thinking of these steps, participants have to decide what alcoholic drinks mean. Is it just referring to beer or wine, or does that include hard liquor as well? And then what's a typical day? Does that include weekends or is it just weekdays? How are they going to respond? Will they actually be honest? How do they format their judgment to fit in one of those response options? How much is somewhat fewer than average? The context in which the item appears can also affect responding. The order of items can also affect responses, and it's actually common and good practice to try and counterbalance or randomize the list of questions in a survey, as well as the responses within the question when appropriate. I know this slide's a little messy, so sorry for that, but we'll try and make our way through it. So when you go to write up your survey items, there are two broad types of items to consider. The first is open-ended items or questions, and this is where you ask a question and give participants the option to answer that question in whatever way they choose. An example of this could be, please tell us your experience of depression over the last month, with a blank line. And this is usually just like a written response. These questions are more qualitative in nature, but they can be very useful in the early stages of research. The second type is closed-ended questions. And this is where you ask a question and provide a list of options for the participant to choose from. So when I ask you how tall you are, I would give you the options of below 5'2", 5'2" to 5'8", or 5'9" or above. When you have a rating scale, such as rate your preference for X, you can present those questions in various ways. You can have a traditional Likert scale type question, or you could have a continuous scale kind of below that, where you have participants slide the bar to the correct location, or you could have them just simply enter a number between 1 and 100 there at the bottom. Also, a quick note about Likert scale options is the number of options you should have. Should you have a Likert scale with 4 options or 7 options or 10? Generally, I would say that you should have no less than 4. Then there's the question of whether to include a middle option. So should there be 5 options where the third option would be neutral? Be mindful about this because this type of default option could lead participants to choose that and just kind of blow through your survey pretty quickly. But also it could be a valid answer for a subject. Maybe their preference is actually neutral for that question. Some researchers don't like to use odd-numbered responses because of this reason, but I don't think there's really a consensus on this. So bottom line, just pay attention to what makes most sense for your survey. There's a guide we can follow to help us write effective items. We can use the Brousseau model, and that's from Peterson 2000. Brousseau stands for brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. Good questions are brief and to the point. You want to try and avoid long or technical questions or words. You just want to make sure it's as easy as possible for participants to answer. You should have relevant questions. Put simply, if your survey is about a topic, like topic X, don't just put a totally random question in there. If you stick to the point, you'll probably get more serious answers from your participants. You want to make sure your questions are unambiguous. There should be one clear way to interpret the question or an answer. For instance, what is an alcoholic drink? Is it beer or hard liquor? That's kind of hard to say. Having ambiguous questions will lead to more variability in your responses. Questions are specific, so it's clear what the response should be about. If you have a question like, rate how often you have been tired and cranky over the past 2 days, well, those are really about 2 different topics, so they should actually be split up into 2 separate questions, one about being tired and one about being cranky. And then questions are objective in a sense that they don't show any of your opinions and they don't lead to anyone answering questions in a certain way, if at all possible. All right, here is a table from the book that goes through some examples of good and bad survey questions. Are you now or have you ever been the possessor of a firearm? The question is pretty long and you could just really say, have you ever owned a gun? Short and to the point. When you're asking about guns, why is it relevant to ask about someone's sexual orientation? Unless it's relevant to your research, skip those types of questions. The question, are you a gun person? That's pretty ambiguous. What does a gun person act like? Do you have to own a certain number of guns to be a gun person? You could alternatively just say, do you currently own a gun? The next one down says, how much have you read about the new gun control measure and sales tax? You can see here that this question is really asking about two separate things. So just ask about one of them for one question, like, how much have you read about the new sales tax? And then make your question objective. So instead of saying, how much do you support a new gun control measure? You could say, what is your view, or something like that. That's more objective. So in lieu of a political survey, try and avoid hot button topics to stay on the point. Okay, so that's the end of this intro video to survey research, and we'll see you next time to talk about sampling.